They say the earth never forgets what's been buried in it. The woods behind a certain hollow in West Virginia don't whisper. They breathe. Every rustle of the leaves, every groan of the old pines, feels like the ground itself trying to push something back down, something it wishes it could keep hidden forever. If you step there at the wrong hour, you'll hear it. The laughter. Not joyful, not innocent, but a kind of fractured mirth that makes your stomach knot before you even see where it's coming from. For over a century, there's been a family here that the locals don't speak about in daylight. You could call them isolated, but that would be a kindness. Inbreeding didn't just happen here by accident. It became the soil in which this bloodline rooted itself, generation after generation, cousin after cousin. Not the occasional whispered scandal you'd find in the countryside, but a deliberate narrowing of the family tree until its branches twisted back into themselves. The photographs, if you can even find them, tell you more than words ever could. Eyes that don't quite point in the same direction, jaws that jut forward unnaturally, skin weathered far beyond its years, and always that expression, a kind of permanent tension between curiosity and something far stranger. Their features tell the story, but their voices tell the truth. Most don't speak in sentences, not in the way you'd think. The sounds they make carry the weight of isolation, of minds shaped by nothing but their own reflection in the faces of kin. When outsiders stumble upon them, whether by accident or by rumor chasing, there's always the same reaction, a frozen moment where pity and horror mix in equal measure. The people here don't ask for help, because help has never come. The world passed them by and they stayed, whether by choice, by ignorance, or by something older and darker than either. This is the past. This is not a tale of what once was. These cousins still live here, still breathe this same mountain air, still marry from the only pool they've ever known. And if you think this kind of thing can't exist in modern America, you're already wrong. The only question left is, how much of their story do you really want to hear? The story begins in the folds of Appalachia, where the land itself conspires to keep secrets. Roads don't lead here so much as they fade into dirt, then into nothing at all. The people who settle this deep learn to live without what the rest of the country calls necessities. And when the world stops visiting, the world stops being real. Their lineage can be traced, if you know which courthouse to dig through, to a time before the Civil War. 2 brothers arrived with their families and carved a life out of these ridges, but in carving that life, they also carved themselves away from anyone else. The railroads came and went, the mines opened and closed, yet the family remained, always here, always together. In the census records, you'll see the same last name repeating again and again. Sometimes a first name will return too, worn like an heirloom passed through decades. Marriage certificates start to blur into something else, and eventually the lines between cousin, spouse, and sibling dissolve into a single truth no one wants to speak aloud. It wasn't just that they stayed within their own blood. Over time, the rest of the region learned to stay away. Outsiders brought questions, and questions turned into pity, and pity into judgment. Pride is a stubborn thing, so the family stopped opening their doors. They stopped explaining, they stopped caring. And the children born in these hills, they didn't know another way. Some were born healthy, though sheltered. Others bore the unmistakable signs that the blood had run too close for too long, unsteady gaits, unusual facial structures, and cognitive differences that would have made survival impossible in a less insulated world. But here they were cared for because they were family. Always family. There's a cruel irony to it. In cities, people talk about loneliness despite being surrounded by millions. Here, surrounded by kin, loneliness took a different form. It wasn't the absence of people, it was the absence of the world. No new stories, no new faces, just a cycle of repetition, an echo chamber where yesterday looked exactly like today, and tomorrow promised nothing else. By the time the 20th century closed, there were entire branches of this family tree who had never spoken to anyone outside their own kin, and that is when their story began to slip into rumor. and rumor into something far darker. The first outsider who truly pulled back the curtain wasn't a journalist, or a lawman, or a preacher. He was just a man who wandered too far while looking for a shortcut. His name's been lost to whispers, but the story stayed. It was summer, the kind of heavy Appalachian heat that presses on you until even the insects slow down. He'd been following a narrow creek, sure it would take him toward the main road. Instead, it took him to a clearing, and in that clearing they stood. 3 figures, barefoot, clothes so worn they seemed part of the skin. Their eyes didn't quite meet his. One man smiled, or tried to, and the sound that came out wasn't a greeting. It was something else. A bark, sharp and unnatural, followed by a laugh that seemed to answer itself. The man would later describe the moment as feeling like he'd stumbled not just into another place, but into another time, or maybe another version of reality entirely. They didn't approach him, they didn't run, they just watched, and he understood, without words, that he wasn't meant to be here. In the years that followed, bits and pieces of truth began to seep out. Photos taken by a few who dared, shaky video clips passed around in hushed tones, each one fueling the legend. Some swore that the family had stopped speaking altogether, communicating only in gestures and sounds. Others said it was worse, that their language had evolved into something outsiders could never understand. The reality was more complex. Some could speak, though slowly, haltingly, with patterns shaped by generations of isolation. Others relied on grunts, nods, and noises that carried specific meaning within the family. It wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was a language of necessity, born in a place where the only audience was each other. But the outside world, once it sees something it can't understand, rarely responds with compassion. The wisp. Hers grew into mocking stories told in bars and online forums. The family became a spectacle, a piece of backwoods folklore that people wanted to gawk at rather than understand. Yet, through all of it, they remained in that same hollow, bound by blood and history, and by something unspoken that outsiders could never seem to name, a loyalty deeper than love and older than sin. There's a reason these hollows keep their silence, a reason neighbors speak low and change the subject when the name comes up. What's left of the family doesn't just live in isolation, they guard it. Outsiders who wander in too far rarely linger, and those who try to document them often leave with less than they came with. A camera missing, a tire mysteriously slashed, a quiet figure at the tree line watching until you're gone. The modern era hasn't erased them, it's only made them more of a ghost story. A few journalists have tried to step inside, to bring light where the shadows have settled for generations. Some arrive with charity, others with curiosity. Most leave unsettled, unsure whether they've met victims of circumstance or keepers of something much older and darker than poverty. In one documented visit, a filmmaker described sitting across from a man whose family had been in the hollow since the 1800s. His eyes seemed to search the air between them, never quite meeting the lens. When he did speak, it came in short bursts, almost like reciting fragments of a memory. The man talked about kin, about keeping close, and about outsiders taking too much. When asked what exactly outsiders had taken, the man only smiled, wide, toothy, and empty, and made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. That's the kind of answer you get here. Nothing you can take to a court, nothing that will stand up as proof, just moments, gestures, and a weight in the air that tells you you're learning more than you should. Still, the bloodline continues, cousin to cousin. In some cases, uncle to niece. Children still born with that familiar look, features repeating themselves like photocopies of photocopies. And the family treats them not as tragedy but as inheritance. To them, this is not broken. This is not wrong. This is the way it has always been. If you stand on the ridge, above the hollow at night, you might see their fires flicker through the trees. It's easy to think of them as a relic, a fading curiosity in a country that moves too fast to care. But that's the mistake most make. They're not fading, they're enduring. There's a point where pity starts to curdle into unease, and for most who've met this family, that point comes fast. It's one thing to hear about cousins marrying cousins, to imagine it as some far-off relic of frontier necessity. It's another to stand in a room where every face looks like a variation of the same one, where you begin to lose track of who is whose child, whose sibling, whose spouse. Some researchers have tried to frame it through the lens of genetics, a slow collapse of diversity leading to traits both visible and hidden. Certain birth defects, speech impediments, cognitive challenges. But here's the part they don't often publish. Along with the hardships, certain patterns of behavior seem to pass through the bloodline too. Not evil, not violent, but strange, repetitive, ritualistic. One visitor described how in the middle of a casual exchange, a man in the family began making a sound over and over, a sharp inhale followed by a low hum, until the others in the room quietly joined in. No words, no explanation, just a shared noise, like a song they'd all known since birth. When it stopped, the conversation picked up again as though nothing had happened. To the outside world, this reads as unsettling, but to them, it's just the language of their lives, the product of never needing to adapt to anyone else's rules, anyone else's customs. If you've made it this far, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed and kept the traditions alive, or would you have left, knowing it meant breaking from everything you'd ever known? Because here's the thing, some have left. A few, over the decades, managed to drift toward towns, toward cities. And in those rare cases, you see something almost cruel, a yearning to go back. For all the hardship, for all the secrecy, that hollow is the only place where they are not different. Out here, in the wide open world, they are marked, questioned, examined. Back there, they are simply home. And so the cycle pulls them back in, like a tide that's been turning for over a century. Those who've tried to end the cycle have learned the truth no one says aloud. The bloodline survives, not because they can't leave, but because leaving costs more than staying. It's not a physical chain, but it may as well be. The land is tied to their name. The houses, collapsing as they are, still belong to them. And the bonds between kin, twisted as they've become, run deeper than any outsider's understanding of family. In the early 2000s, a social worker from the nearest county made it her mission to intervene. She documented the living conditions, the educational gaps, the medical issues that were plain even at a glance. She petitioned for outside assistance, for relocation, for counseling. On paper, she had a case. In reality, she hit a wall. Every family member she approached shut the door. Those who answered at all said the same thing in different words. They were fine. They didn't want help. Some locals believe the distrust runs so deep because of what happened decades earlier, when a similar intervention ended with children being removed from the hollow. The story goes that most of them found their way back within years, drifting home one by one until the family was whole again. Whatever they'd seen outside didn't hold them. Today, the youngest generation walks the same dirt paths as their grandparents and great-grandparents. Their games are played in the same fields, their stories told by the same voices. They inherit not just blood, but the shape of life itself, narrow, repetitive, unbroken. There is something almost defiant about their persistence. In a nation obsessed with forward motion, they have remained still. In a culture that values mixing, blending, expanding, they have turned inward, circling the wagons around their own. It leaves you wondering, is this survival or is it surrender? Are they preserving something sacred or protecting something they can't afford the world to see? Stand in that hollow for just a moment too long, and the answer might start to matter less than the way the air feels, heavy, expectant, as if you've stepped into a living memory that doesn't want to let go. Some truths don't fade, they wait, and in that hollow, the truth is everywhere, woven into the rust on the fences, etched in the worn grooves of front porch steps, carried in the eyes of those who've known nothing else. Generations have passed since the first cousins bound themselves to one another, but the pattern hasn't broken. If anything, it has deepened, the faces growing more alike, the stories less varied, the names repeating like echoes through a narrow canyon. From the outside, it's easy to frame it as tragedy, to imagine rescue missions or government orders that could scatter the family into the wider world. But history tells us something colder. People do not leave the life they believe they belong to, not for comfort, not for opportunity, and not for freedom as we define it. The few who've spoken openly about the family, neighbors, hunters, occasional drifters, share a common thread in their accounts. None describe malice, none describe violence. What they describe is a feeling, a quiet wrongness, like finding a clock that ticks in reverse. It's not what you see that unsettles you, it's what you can't shake after you've left. And so, the hollow remains. Children are born, they grow, they marry, they have children of their own. The cycle turns over again and again, untouched by the outside world, except for those rare accidental intrusions, moments when someone stumbles too far down the wrong dirt road and finds themselves being watched by faces that are all too similar. It's a piece of America that isn't on any map, not because it's hidden, but because it's ignored. As if by pretending it's folklore, we can avoid the discomfort of admitting it's still happening today. Because to admit that is to admit something we don't want to believe, that even in an age of satellites and smartphones, entire worlds still exist just beyond the reach of the light. And if you go looking for this one, remember, when you see them watching you from the tree line, you're not discovering them. They're deciding whether or not to let you leave.